sound, speed, cameras, rolling. All right, Tim. Action.
Hello, my name's Tim Malonen. I'm a history teacher. And today we're going to talk about the myth of the lost cause, which is a subsection of the Reconstruction lecture, which would precede this. The myth of the lost cause is a result, a cause of the failure of Reconstruction. If you remember the Reconstruction lecture, we talked about the fact that Reconstruction, as envisioned by the victorious North after the Civil War, failed. Reconstruction failed. And one of the reasons it failed, and one of the reasons that its failure is not better known in American historiography, is because of the myth of the lost cause. The myth of the lost cause is a very, very interesting historical topic because it's a myth, it's an untruth, it's a rather remarkable distortion of what happened after the Civil War, what Reconstruction was about, and how Reconstruction is considered to this day. And we talked about how Reconstruction has been revised, rescued as it were, sort of. The effort is still on to rescue Reconstruction from the sort of wastebasket of American history. The myth of the lost cause. Myths, untruths about our past are very important, very influential. And historians like me, while there were historians, well-known historians 100 years ago or 150 years ago who helped construct the myth, what a disservice to the discipline of history these men were. They participated in myth-making, putting in the history books and into popular culture, in classrooms, for decades, a misconception, a lie about the American past. And man, oh man, has it ever been influential. And of course, when you consider the myth of the lost cause, the general question of mythology in history and its, amazingly to me, persistence. And it's, what do I want to say? Well, we'll talk about myth in history as we go along here today. First, First, a definition. I'm big on definitions of terms in history. I think there's not enough of that. But definition, myth, a usually traditional story of ostensibly historical events that serves to unfold part of a worldview of a people or explain a practice, belief, or natural phenomenon. A traditional story of ostensibly historical events. Ostensibly historical events. Number 2, an unfounded false notion. There we go. Number 3, an unproved or false collective belief that is used to justify a social institution. There we go. An unproven or false collective belief used to justify a social institution or used to justify a particular view of history. A false view of history. Now for the myth of the lost cause, a definition. The myth of the lost cause, and again, I always put quotation marks around that, is the very successful effort by the defeated white Southerners to falsely recast the Civil War and Reconstruction in historic terms more favorable to them. The term the lost cause refers to the Confederacy. When you hear the term lost cause, they're talking about the nascent, the attempted nation state of the United States Confederacy. The effort by 11 states to secede from the Union in 1860, 1861, and then to 1865 when their effort was militarily defeated and the Confederate government fell. And these states were reintegrated back into the Union during the period called Reconstruction. Of course, the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, Reconstruction, 1865 to 1876. 1865, some historians say Reconstruction started during the war, 1863, 1864. I think it's simpler if we just say after the war, 1865. To rewrite the history of the Confederacy, the myth of the lost cause. Very successful. In fact, we're fighting that battle to demythologize the Confederacy to this day. Now, this is 2024, January 2024, and there's a presidential election on, and one of the candidates on the Republican side is Nikki Haley, who used to be governor of South Carolina. South Carolina, the first state to secede. Nikki Haley. And a couple of weeks ago, she was asked what caused the Civil War. Now, the Civil War, 1861. This is 2024. I have to make the case to you that history is relevant and that you should study history. This is 2024. And if it was up to me, I'd ask every candidate who runs for office at any level that question in the United States. What caused the Civil War? Because as we'll come to find out, one of the tenets of the myth is that it wasn't about slavery. It wasn't about slavery. That's one of the tenets of the myth. So this reporter asked Nikki Haley, ex-governor of South Carolina, what caused the Civil War? And she talked about, she didn't use the term states' rights, but she said it was about freedom. For states to secede is when the context. It was about liberty, which again is one of the tenets of the lost cause. No, as we talked about when we talked about the Civil War a couple of lectures ago, come on, it's about slavery. It was about slavery. Number one, with a bullet. Slavery. She muffed the question. Now, she was criticized for it, but it went away really quickly, And again, nobody's asked her about, for example, the Reconstruction Amendments. We'll talk about them in a minute. Well, no, the 14th Amendment's much in the news now about rebellion and insurgency and whether you can run for office after you were involved in an insurgency. We'll come back to that too. Here's some points about the myth of the lost cause. The creators of the myth, after the Civil War, ex-Confederates, mostly, intentionally created the principles and misinformation of the lost cause. That's from a historian, Alan T. Nolan. Intentionally. It was done on purpose. The myth was created self-consciously by men who wanted to mythologize the Confederacy and mythologize the struggle to perpetuate human bondage, chattel slavery. They did it on purpose. They knew what they were doing, and they knew what they were doing was false. They knew it. They did it on purpose. It was done on purpose to confuse the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction. And boy, highly successful. And again, that battle is going on today. What's that, 165 years after? Again, let me just pause and say, what an example of the consequences of history. In this instance, the misreading of it, the intentional lying about the past. 160 some years later, we're still fighting that battle. And again, you get people say, and you know, I was a history teacher for years. You get students say, the past. Pfft. I mean, come on. The lost cause was expressly a rationalization, a cover-up. The lost cause version of the Civil War and Reconstruction is a caricature, possible in part because of the false treatment of slavery and black people. Now, again, that's from Alan T. Nolan. Let me say that again. The lost cause version of the Civil War and Reconstruction is a caricature possible in part because of the persistence of racism in the United States. When you sort of pare it all down, the lost cause, that it has any salience, is because of the persistence of racism in the American culture, in the American politics, in American intellectual life, all the way up and down the categories. The persistence of racism. It was done by racists to promote racism, and it still is to this day. Promoting racism. The lost cause myth has a well-known symbol. You recognize this? The stars and bars, the Confederate battle flag. Now let me note that this was not the national flag of the Confederacy. That was something different, but this, the battle flag, the armies, the flag of the Confederate armies, has come down to history as the best known symbol of the myth of the lost cause. You can see this even here in northern Illinois, where I am, which was Lincoln country through and through back during the war and Reconstruction. Usually on a pickup truck, right? In the back windshield of a pickup truck. And occasionally you'll see bumper stickers with the flag on it, and they'll say, heritage, not hate. No. This symbol stands for American racism. I don't care what people who put it on their pickup truck say the reason is that they're putting it on their pickup truck. Whenever I see it, I go, a racist. Simple, true. Now let's talk about the persistence of the myth. The myth of the lost cause was enhanced and made popular through mass media. In other words, use shorthand, Hollywood perpetuated the myth for decades. The nascent Hollywood, around the turn of the 20th century. Particularly two famous movies, The Birth of a Nation, 1915, which is considered the first feature-length motion picture. And it's a silent picture, of course. Oh my God, have you ever seen Birth of a Nation? Check it out. I mean, the race, first off, there were no blacks in Birth of a Nation, but there were plenty of black characters cast as devils, cast as the bad guys. And they were white actors in blackface. There's like hundreds of white actors in blackface in Birth of a Nation. Because, of course, Griffin, the director, producer, the writer, was a racist. So he wasn't going to put any, but that was back during segregation, in 1915. Hardcore segregation after Reconstruction had totally been obliterated. And the nation was committed, because Woodrow Wilson the president at the time, had a White House viewing of Birth of a Nation and lauded it and applauded it and said every American should see it. It's this stinking racist tract, myth of the lost cause from top to bottom, about the heroes are Ku Klux Klan members. I'm not kidding you. And they're out there killing blacks to save white women. It's an amazing thing. It's still considered one of the great motion pictures because it was the first and it did a lot of firsts. Birth of a Nation. Check it out. And the other movie is Gone with the Wind, 1939. Gone with the Wind. Again, usually in the top 10 or top 3 or 4 of the best motion pictures ever made. And again, it's an apologia for white supremacy, for the myth of the lost cause. Gone with the Wind is a proponent of the myth, perpetuates the myth. It was based on the best-selling novel by Margaret Mitchell. Gone with the Wind might be the most popular movie of all time and offers a blatant apologia for the slave South and resistance to Reconstruction and racism. In 1939. 1939. That's the day that my mother-in-law was born. She's still alive. And other mass media too. I mean, again, Nikki Haley, giving an effect to the answer, what caused the Civil War, the states' rights thing. I mean, this is alive and well. As a historian, I'm kind of like, yeah, history, long ago history, divides the country. The divisions we have, and all the political commentators are talking about how divided we are these days, how polarized, that seems to be the word they're using. That polarization is about history. It's about the past. It's been constructed. This polarization has been constructed to a large part because of the persistence of a myth, of an untrue characterization of the past from 160 years ago. I keep coming back to that point because I'm a historian, right? And during my teaching career, I battled with the inattention of my students, and I'm not going to get down. I understand when you're 18, 19, 20 years old that I'm thinking about the future, man. I'm thinking about the future. I understand that mentality. But today I'm talking about something that's old and as relevant as it can get. And get it straight in your head, right? America. Here are some elements of the myth of the lost cause. Number one, the states' rights dodge, that's what I call it, of what caused the Civil War. And again, here we have the example of Republican candidate for president Nikki Haley flubbing what caused the Civil War. She didn't use, again, let me remind you, she didn't use the term states' rights, but that's where she was at. That's what she was talking about. When she said the Civil War was about liberty, she wasn't talking about freedom for the slaves. She was talking about states' liberties vis-a-vis the federal government, the right to leave. That's what she was talking about. Number two, elements of the myth. The Confederacy was a noble cause, fought for by noble men. The resurrection of these rebels, these traitors. Most of them, the leadership, had taken an oath to uphold the Constitution and then broke that oath. They were traitors, treasonous, and yet, again, we're going to get into the Confederate monument thing here in a minute. Because over the last few years, Robert E. Lee statues and Jefferson Davis statues, yeah, believe it or not, in the South, there were statues, monuments to Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, who had been at one time vice president of the United States. Talk about taking an oath and then betraying that oath. Robert E. Lee was the prominent, was the number one soldier in the Army when the war broke out. He had taken an oath to uphold the Constitution. And yet here it's, again, 160 years later, and finally there's been kind of an accounting of these monuments. We'll come back to the monument thing in a minute. And a lot of them have disappeared. Yeah, good. These men not only broke their oath to defend the Constitution of the United States, they were defending chattel slavery. They were defending human bondage. They were defending a system where human beings were treated like cattle. Okay? I'm an old farm boy, So that's sort of where I go when I try to describe slavery, what we're talking about. Where human beings are treated like cows and pigs and lambs, bought and sold, their teeth checked out. A third element of the myth. Slavery wasn't so bad. Oh, again, you're hearing that to this day. Slavery wasn't that bad. The slaves were happy and fought for the South. You hear that to this day. The slaves were happy. And fought for the South. Now, here's the deal with that. Masters in the South, slave owners, went to the war, and they often took their personal slaves with them. In other words, a rich plantation owner would go off and join the Confederate Army, get a commission as a captain or a major or a colonel, and he'd go off to war with one or two of his personal slave attendants. The rich people in the South, the plantation owners, men and women, had personal slaves. They dressed them. They took care of them. They carried stuff for them. So are you going to count those as soldiers for the Confederacy? Also, the Confederate Army had brigades of slaves to dig their fortifications and to put up their camps. They were slaves. They were ordered to serve the Confederate Army. Are you going to count them as members of the Confederate Army? It's nonsense. Number 4, the myth of separate but equal. After the war, when Reconstruction was defeated and the Reconstruction Amendments, 13, 14, and 15, we'll come back to them in more detail. Up until Brown versus Board of Education in, 1954? When the Supreme Court said, no, you can't have separate school systems for blacks and whites. Right? Oh no, the schools are equal. It's okay if you segregate by race if the schools are equal. What a joke that was. What a joke. Separate but equal. In Mississippi, from like the end of the Civil War up until Brown versus Board of Education, almost 100 years, the only law school in Mississippi was at the University of Mississippi, which was segregated. No black people could go to the University of Mississippi, although all the black people in the state paid taxes to support the University of Mississippi. They couldn't go there. Oh no, we have a separate, the Tuskegee Institute or whatever over here, separate but equal. Of course, they get a 10th or a 20th of the money per student. Separate but equal. Another part of the myth. The myth ignores the second founding, which I just talked about, the Reconstruction Amendments, again, 13, 14, and 15. The amendments added to the Constitution after the Civil War to try to ameliorate, to change the system that had allowed for 4 million slaves before the war. I mean, let's talk about the Constitution, right? This Constitution. By the way, I think right now the Constitution of the United States is kind of in crisis. And I would expect that at some point there's going to be some amendments added as a result of the polarization that's happening right now. That's just a guess, right? I think, the Supreme Court needs to be reviewed and the Electoral College needs to be reviewed. The size of the House of Representatives needs to be reviewed. There's a number of things, changes I think that are necessary. And we seem to be, and again, I believe historians have to try to predict the future. I mean, what's the point of studying the past in detail if you can't try to say, well, what are we headed towards? And, I don't think there's going to be a second Civil War. You hear that in the air now. I don't think that. But I think there's going to come a time where the foibles and the shortcomings of our current Constitution are going to have to be addressed. And in a democratic way, more democracy. So ignore the Reconstruction Amendments. That's part of the myth. Part of the myth, the vigilante resistance to Reconstruction. The Klan. There were other groups too, but for us, the Ku Klux Klan was a noble cause. Boy, that's put forward in both The Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind in spades. The heroes are the Night Riders who went out and terrorized African Americans who wanted to vote and their white supporters, terrorized them, killed them, burned their houses. Those guys were noble men, according to the myth. Oh, here's a part, here's one of the elements of the myth of the lost cause that, you might think is obscure, but being from Galena, Illinois, U.S. Grant's hometown, I find very interesting. An element of the myth is the trashing of Grant and the elevation of Lee versus Grant. Lee, the noble man, Grant, the drunk. Right? I mean, what do you hear historically about Ulysses S. Grant? He was a drunk and a butcher, over the top men. The fact of the matter is that Ulysses S. Grant was the best general in United States history by far. By far the best general we had. His Vicksburg campaign is just brilliant. It's brilliant. It should be studied. It is studied. No, Grant was a drunken butcher. And here's another one that's somewhat obscure. The myth of the lost cause elevates the Battle of Gettysburg to a turning point in the war. I disagree with that. And I think it's part of the myth. The turning point in the war, Civil War, and we talked about this a couple of lectures ago, was the election in November of 1864, when Abraham Lincoln was reelected against George McClellan, who'd been general of the Army of the Potomac earlier in the war. Lincoln's reelection meant what? 4 more years of war. McClellan, his opponent, again in the North, the South wasn't voting, of course, they were in secession. McClellan had run on a let's negotiate with the Confederacy. So the choice in the election of 1864 was rather stark. And again, as I said in the lecture on the Civil War, once Lincoln's reelected, the desertion rate in the Confederate armies skyrocketed. The boys started going home because they knew they were doomed. And I mean, the North, as I said, fought the war with one hand tied behind its back. They didn't fully mobilize. The South fully mobilized. The North did not. So Gettysburg, no, that's not the turning point. The election of 1864 is the turning point in the war. The myth of the lost cause is still affecting the teaching of history today. Yes. I have a folder with newspaper clippings, and there's, when I say southern states, it's a euphemism, it's a shortcut. Primarily talking about the 11 states that seceded from the Union. Like Florida, for instance. Florida today their state education board is passing motions to teach the myth of the lost cause in class and to suppress the teaching of the truth about the Civil War and Reconstruction and segregation and Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement. To suppress that teaching. Our educational system is a battleground where the myth is being perpetuated today. Again, you read articles about schools in Florida and Mississippi and Alabama. What they can teach and what they can't teach is being politicized, and is being politicized by people who support, whether vehemently, openly, or as subterfuge, the myth of the lost cause. To this day. Now let's talk about what I call the monumentalization. There's quite a word for you. I think I made it up. Kind of like it. The monumentalization of the lost cause. And here we're talking about the statues we referred to earlier. And the ubiquitous nature, especially in the South, but not just in the South, mostly in the South, the monumentalization of the Confederacy and the leaders of the Confederacy. And it raises a more general question about historical monuments in general. What do you think about historical monuments? What gets monumentalized and why? Now, I can guarantee you that, if you live in a town or a city above 5,000 population, there's historical monuments in your town. I mean, think. They're there. Somebody decided to put them up. Usually a committee, right? And they're usually on public ground and, in a sense, tax supported. Not all. Some are on private ground and privately supported. But they're usually put in a place where the public can see them. They're meant to have an effect. And I'd like to take this opportunity for you to think in your town the historical monuments. Now, in my town of Belvidere, Illinois, which is the county seat of Boone County, at the courthouse, across the street from the courthouse, is a huge, 60-foot tall monument to Union soldiers. Yeah. A Civil War monument for the Union side. It was put up like in 1815 or 1818, or 1918, years after the Civil War was over. Now, if you go down south where there's more monuments to the Confederacy, most of them went up around the turn of the century, 1900 to 1920. Now you're like, wait a minute, that's 50 years after the war? The monuments didn't go up right after the war. They went up 50 years later, at the height of what you'd call Jim Crow. Now, we talked about Jim Crow, the euphemism for the South, not just the South, but mostly the South, the failure of Reconstruction to create equality for the freed slaves then became militant, legal, brutal, the Night Riders, lynching. After the failure of Reconstruction, white supremacy at its height, 1900, 1910. That's when these Confederate monuments went up. And that's also when, I mean, in Illinois, in northern Illinois, I'm fairly familiar with, every courthouse in the 12 counties in northern Illinois has a Civil War monument to Union soldiers, which were put up in response to the monuments that were going up in the South. So you're putting up monuments to Robert E. Lee and Bedford Forrest and the Confederate soldier. And so the North was like, well, we're going to put up monuments to our soldiers too. So it was like a reaction, an action, and a reaction. And again, I encourage you, no matter where you are when you see this, to think, is there a Civil War monument of some kind in my town? That's the history of even the northern monuments to Union soldiers, like in Belvedere in Boone County, Illinois, are tinged with white supremacy, are tinged by the myth. They're a reaction to the myth. Again, history is so interesting, isn't it? And monuments are meant to be self-consciously a manifestation of historical consciousness of a community. Now, I'm like most people in that throughout most of my life, I walked by monuments, never thought twice about them. Just right by, And some of them are kind of hokey. It's true, some of them aren't good art. They're kind of bad. I understand that, but still, I encourage you to think about the monumentalization in your community. Now, in Northern Illinois, there's a lot to Native Americans. And I don't remember if we talked about the monumentalization of Native Americans when we talked about Native Americans lectures ago. But there's a lot of monuments to Native Americans. And again, think about it. These Civil War monuments, think about them. I encourage you. Who gets monumentalized and why? And of course, the decision to put up statues of Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis has been rescinded here just in the last 4 or 5 years. Communities, the nation, the culture, the media have turned, after decades and decades and decades, have turned the monument question around, if you want to think of it that way. It's a very interesting historical question. And again, I encourage you to become conscious of the monuments in your town and ask historical questions about them. Here's an article by Holland Cotter, New York Times, August of 2017. We need to move, not destroy Confederate monuments. And I'd like to present some of the quotes from that article. The Charlottesville incident, and that was in, 2017, in Charlottesville, Virginia, where there was a riot over a Robert E. Lee statue, right? Some right-wingers, some supporters of the Confederacy marched, and there was a counter-demonstration, and the next day some woman was killed by a car driving into the crowd, and the supporters the supporters of the Robert E. Lee statue, if you remember, they got the torchlights and the flags, and they're marching down, "Jews will not replace us." Like blacks and Jews, Nazis. it's this article is in response to that incident. The Charlottesville incident has created a consciousness-raising call to eliminate or defend the statues associated with the lost cause of the Confederacy. A frenzied ideological war over visual images was underway. A frenzied ideological war over visual images, over art, historical art. A frenzied ideological war. I don't know. The monument thing's kind of gone here, 7 years later? 6 years later? Although not entirely. If you watch the news, there's still agitation about the monuments. In short, the Charlottesville Lee Monument is far less about mourning a hero and a gone but not forgotten culture than about using elegiac, that is, poetic expression of grief, sentiment to sugarcoat a secretly seditious present. Well, so these statues are about now? They put up 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, most of them. Not all of them, but most of them. They're about now. So in other words, the monuments that I just encouraged you to go see in your own town are about now, according to Cotter. It's important to understand the conceptual clockwork of such monuments, how through style and guile they deliver messages that are broadcasting clearly and dangerously in the present. The violent defense of Lee Monument in Charlottesville verifies that. These old monuments are still broadcasting clearly and dangerously in the present. Now, I don't know if I agree. Again, I lived in Galena most of my life, and, it's a historic town. And we used to make fun of its historical nature and the tourists that would come to visit Grant's home, us locals. And we were missing the point. A lot of people are missing the point. These monuments resonate, is that a good word? Resonate into the present. And the people who put them up wanted them to. The Confederate monuments are instruments of ideological persuasion. With ethical messages we might well find repellent if we could read their visual symbols, that language above language. And we need to learn to be symbol readers with our eyes wide open in our own political moment. Wow, heavy. That's heavy. And as a historian, I'm like, wow, yeah, historical resonance of these monuments. They were meant to persist. Their message was meant to persist. And what's their message? White supremacy, by and large. White supremacy. It was meant, and we could read their visual symbols, that language above language. Now, I don't know, that's kind of heavy, isn't it? That language above language, symbolism, historical symbolism. It's interesting. And it's pertinent right now. Now I want to talk about the Reconstruction Amendments. Now, again, I don't know how much of this I said in the Reconstruction lecture, which precedes this. So, what do you think? Should I do it anyway, and then we can cut it if it's redundant?
Do it.
Okay. There's an article that first appeared in the New Republic in 2008 by Doug Kendall. Ignoring the Reconstruction Amendments was the name of the article. The Reconstruction Amendments. After the Civil War, the Constitution, our slave-abetting, our slave-supporting Constitution. The Constitution written in that Freedom Hall in Philadelphia in 1787, that Constitution, which is worshipped by some, thought of as holy writ by some, was a slave-supporting document. Now again, you say that, and you can get rebuttal. But no, I mean, come on. When that document was written and ratified in 1787 and 1788, there were 800,000 slaves in the then United States. 800,000. By 1860, when the Civil War breaks out, there were over 4 million. 5 times as many. So you're telling me the document was anti-slavery? I don't think so. So the pro-slavery aspects of our fundamental law, which is what the Constitution is, had to be expunged, had to be changed in lieu of the Civil War and the defeat of the South and the Emancipation Proclamation. And the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were added to the Constitution to do that. Some have called it, and Kendall is one of them, the second founding. And he says it's every bit as important as the original founding. And yet, ignoring the Reconstruction Amendments, that for decades we've ignored the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, particularly the 14th Amendment. Here's some quotes from his article. The American conversation right now suffers from an odd pathology. Our tendency to leave the fundamental changes to our Constitution made after the Civil War out of our discussions of our nation's most important document. I think that's true. In fact, the words on parchment in the original 1787 Constitution embedded slavery far more securely than it did equality. It took the 14th Amendment, passed after the Civil War, 1868, to put equal citizenship at our Constitution's core. Equal citizenship. The 14th Amendment guaranteed equal citizenship, civil rights, due process for all Americans, and gave Congress vast new powers to enforce these mandates. The 14th Amendment guarantees at the end equal protection of the laws. And it says that the Congress, the federal government in Washington, D.C., is charged with the responsibility to enforce equal protection of the laws. That's in the Constitution. That's fundamental law in the United States. It's breathtaking. And perhaps that's the reason that the 14th Amendment is ignored when we talk about the Constitution. I mean, I have 30-some different textbooks for survey classes, freshman, sophomore year in college at home. And Kendall is right. The chapters on Reconstruction, the aftermath of the Civil War, do not spend more than a paragraph or two on the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, the most fundamental change to our constitutional order in our history. The federal government in Washington, D.C. is mandated by the 14th Amendment to enforce equal protection of the laws for all citizens of the United States. So if a state or local government is violating equal protection of the laws, the feds come. The federal government comes and rectifies the situation and slaps down the local school board or the county board or the state legislature that's not fulfilling the charge for equal protection of the laws for all citizens? I mean, most Americans don't realize that power dynamic. That's why when someone feels their rights are being violated, they go to federal court. Of course they do. The 14th Amendment dictates that they go to federal court because the federal government is charged with equal protection of the laws. No wonder the civil rights or the Reconstruction Amendments are ignored. Not one American in 1,000 can identify the Ohio Congressman John Bingham as the main drafter of the 14th Amendment. He drafted Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, which is perhaps the single most important paragraph in our Constitution. Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, the single most important paragraph in the Constitution, added in 1868. Remember, ignoring that amendment is one of the tenets of the myth of the lost cause. Bingham and other Reconstruction era founders are not just obscure, they are buried under bad history. The myth of the lost cause. Bad history. Yet bringing our nation's second founding, as the Reconstruction Amendments are appropriately called, back into the constitutional conversation should be a central focus. The article first appeared in the New Republic on March 27th, 2008. The 14th Amendment. Oh, as an American, it's like, what's your favorite amendment to the Constitution? Well, you know what? First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. First Amendment, right? Oh, yes. And that used to be my favorite, too. But then I read Bingham's article. No. 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, equal protection of the laws. America, God, I love this country. Equal protection of the laws. And what a struggle. Right now, 2024, we're engaged in a struggle over equal protection of the laws and the 14th Amendment. Here's another article, Slavery Did Not Die Honestly, by David Blight, 2015. A couple of quotes. Among all the enactments of Reconstruction, none embodied the lasting significance or the heart of the conflict in this revolution and counter-revolution better than Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. It ought to be embraced as holy writ that binds our national community, that fortifies the very idea of America born of this second founding. No more important language exists to this day in the Constitution than Bingham's two sentences. His goal, as he said many times in the floor debates in Congress, was to federalize the Bill of Rights and make the federal government responsible for enforcing the basic human rights of Americans, which include birthright citizenship and equality before the law. Birthright citizenship. If you're born in the United States, you're a citizen. Doesn't matter the status of your parents. That was put in to thwart the defeated southern states from once they were readmitted to the Union from enacting excuses to disenfranchise and decitizenize the liberated slaves. If you're born here, you're a citizen. And that's under attack today, right? And here's a photograph from the demonstrations in Charlottesville in 2017 that I talked about earlier. And what could be more obvious? Here we have a crowd of marchers, and there's the Nazi flag, and right next to it, the next marcher over has a Confederate flag. I mean, look at this. The Confederate flag and the swastika and the same parade and the same march. What could be clearer as to where that symbol, the stars and bars, the Confederate battle flag, where that belongs historically, next to the German Nazi flag? That's what the marchers think is appropriate. And yet you'll get this heritage, not hate business from the pickup drivers with the Confederate flag in their back window. Now, just to finish up, we talked about the myth of the lost cause. It's a myth. It's untrue. It's meant to mislead. Here are some other American myths. There's quite a few of them. The noble savage myth. That's about Native Americans. We respect them and we really think that they had great qualities, but we killed them. The noble myth. The noble savage myth. The Thanksgiving myth of the Native Americans and the Pilgrims getting together. The virgin land myth. Also the wilderness myth, or the Daniel Boone myth, that there's land that nobody owns out there, and Americans have the right to go out there and take it. The virgin land, there were people out there sort of just read out of the myth. The pioneers into the wilderness. The founding fathers myth, that these men were somehow elevated above the prosaic politics and power relations of the day, that they were operating on some ethereal plane higher than mortal men. The Constitution myth, we talked about that the original Constitution was some sort of divine document. The manifest destiny myth, this comes around in the Spanish-American War. We'll talk about that later on. The Mexican War myth. Also the southern border myth. And this is really pertinent today with all the talk about immigration and the southern border, that somehow that border was decreed by God, that somehow that border is some sort of inevitable, metaphysical thing. I mean, that's artificial. That line between the United States and Mexico is historical artifact. It's in your mind. The American imperialism myth, also called the white man's burden myth. Again, the Spanish-American War is sort of the typical example of this myth, and even to this day in textbooks, the causes and results of the Spanish-American War are mythologized. Oh, and let's not forget the Vietnam POW MIA myth, that there were boys left behind in the tiger cages, and Sylvester Stallone and Walker, Texas, MD. No, wait. What's his name? Chuck Norris. There we go. And Chuck Norris had to go back. How many times? Excuse me. How many times did he go back to get the boys left behind? There are no boys left behind. Sorry. So here, let me finish up with this. Again, some quotes from an article by Nicholas Kortz and Patrick Gerster in 1973. One of the major thrusts of American historiography, at least in the 20th century, and I'd say into this century, has been the reinterpretation of American historical myths, many of which were products of historians themselves. That's true. Professor C. Van Woodward suggests not the destruction of myths, but their serious critique. Don't destroy the myths, critique them. Some suggest the validity of studying the past within the framework of myth and reality. The framework of myth and reality. All men, then, to a degree, live in accordance with the norms and principles that have been drawn from myth. All men, to a certain degree, live with the norms and principles that have been drawn from myth. The recognition and understanding of myth seems absolutely essential to the study of history. The study of myth, well, we've sort of suggested that in this lecture, right? That the myth of the lost cause, its construction and its perseverance, is very illustrative of history. Untangling the lost cause myth from American story will be hard. An article by William R. Black, Washington Post, August 25th, 2018. It will be difficult to reject the lost cause, he writes. The collection of historical myths meant to whitewash the hard truths of slavery in the Civil War without rejecting American nationalism. Whoa. Excuse me. The myth has played a key role in the construction of American nationalism. And Black says it's going to be hard to untangle them. Whoa. Now, we'll talk about nationalism more in detail. The most destructive, the most persistent, the most powerful ism of them all, nationalism. American nationalism was constructed with the myth of the lost cause. The myth helped reunite the country in white supremacy after the war, and that reunification of the country in racism after the war led to the American evolution into globe-straddling superpower. And Black's saying, how are you going to untangle them? And that equal protection of the laws undermines American nationalism? Whoa. The lost cause itself was a project of American nationalism. Many Americans felt it necessary to adopt the myths of the lost cause to heal the wounds of the Civil War, to rebuild the nation. American nationalism and the lost cause are therefore tightly woven together. Both Confederate nationalism and American nationalism, subsequent American nationalism, centered on a celebration of white supremacy. Therefore, America's globe-straddling superpower is a result of the myth of the lost cause, a myth profoundly affected the course of history. This leads to dark places, right? But it also helps explain, I think, the polarization currently, right? American nationalism and the myth of the lost cause, and several other myths, I might say, has led to our success. And to disentangle them would mean the end of American empire? Wow, that's profound. It's very interesting. Very interesting concept. If you liked this video, there's more on YouTube. Tim Malone, History Lectures. Like and subscribe.